At our divorce hearing in downtown Boston, my husband, Julian Vance, leaned back in his mahogany chair and looked right at the presiding judge. His face wore the smug, impenetrable confidence of a man who believed he held every winning card in the deck. He cleared his throat, and the warm voice that had once made me fall in love with him echoed with a chilling cruelty. "Your Honor, my wife never contributed a single dime to Vance and Associates. She was a homemaker who stayed in the kitchen. She has no understanding of corporate architecture or commercial real estate, and she certainly doesn't deserve half of an empire. She had no hand in building." 2 rows behind him sat Victoria Sterling, his chief financial officer and, conveniently, his current mistress. She wore a flawless Dior suit and a subtle, victorious smile. She honestly believed that when the gavel fell today, the Vance empire would be entirely theirs, and I would be escorted out the heavy oak doors with absolutely nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't shed a single tear. My silence made Julian think I had surrendered to his power and his seemingly bottomless bank accounts. He was wrong. My attorney, Robert Harrison, slowly stood up. He didn't launch into an emotional tirade about infidelity, nor did he plead for the court's sympathy. Instead, he simply placed a 15-year-old, blue-backed commercial loan agreement on the judge's bench. The judge adjusted his glasses and examined the document. The courtroom was dead silent, save for the crisp rustle of turning pages. When the judge reached the final page, his demeanor shifted. His eyes narrowed as he looked down at my husband with a heavy, unyielding stare. "Mr. Vance?" the judge began, his voice dangerously calm. "If your wife never contributed anything to your company, as you just stated under oath, then why does her name appear here as the sole guarantor for the emergency loan that saved your firm 15 years ago?" For the first time that morning, my arrogant husband had absolutely nothing to say. The smile on Victoria Sterling's face instantly froze. But that old document wasn't the biggest secret he was trying to hide. To understand how we ended up on opposite sides of a courtroom, you have to go back 15 years. Back when Boston was just a daunting city for 2 kids trying to make it for. Julian was a brilliant but broke architecture graduate. He had grand blueprints and a fiery ambition, but his credit score was ruined by student debt, and no bank in Massachusetts would lend a dime to a man with no collateral. I was a project coordinator at a mutual fund. When I looked at Julian, I saw his fire, and I believed in him unconditionally. When every financial institution turned him away, I drained my savings and put up the small, mortgage-free house in Beacon Hill, my only inheritance from my late parents, as collateral to secure his first business loan. In the early days of Vance and Associates, I wasn't just a wife. I was the bookkeeper, the paralegal, the receptionist, and the project manager. I stayed up until 3 a.m. making red-line corrections on blueprints so we wouldn't miss bidding deadlines. I worked without a salary and skipped meals so the company's cash flow wouldn't dry up. When the firm finally landed its first major municipal contract and we moved into a high-rise office overlooking Boston Harbor, Julian's attitude shifted. He gently pushed me out of the frame. "You've worked too hard for too long, Clara," he told me one evening, kissing my forehead. "Corporate real estate is vicious. Let me handle the business. It's your time to relax and just be my wife." Believing it was an act of love and protection, I handed over the ledgers and stepped back. Over the years, Julian systematically rewrote our history. At high society galas and in magazine interviews, he spun a narrative of a self-made titan who built a dynasty from scratch. I faded into the background, becoming a polite shadow in my own life. I never corrected him because I believed his success was our success. We were a team. I was naive to think a man's betrayal stops at stealing your money. He also wanted to erase my existence from his history. The dismantling of my marriage began when Victoria Sterling joined the firm as the Director of Financial Strategy, armed with a Wharton degree, sharp features, and a ruthless ambition. She quickly became Julian's right hand. I didn't catch them in bed. And I didn't find lipstick on his collar. My first clue was in the numbers. Julian started taking extended strategic investor trips to New York and Chicago. Always with Victoria. The passwords to our joint financial management software, which I had set up a decade ago, were suddenly changed due to a corporate security upgrade. Then, while organizing Julian's home office, I found a misplaced invoice from an elite interior design firm. It was for a luxury penthouse in the Seaport District, Boston's most expensive real estate. The bill was over $200. Ling ling ling. And the signatory for the corporate expense was Victoria Sterling. When I casually asked Julian about the property over dinner, he didn't even look up from his steak. It's a corporate rental, Clara. We use it to host international developers. You don't understand modern corporate logistics. So please don't interfere. Victoria's accounting team has it perfectly handled. I didn't press the issue, but my intuition, honed by years in the financial sector, screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. But the Seaport penthouse wasn't the asset he was trying hardest to hide. I didn't hire a private investigator or throw a hysterical fit. I simply waited for a Friday afternoon when I knew Julian was at a job site, drove down to the Seaport penthouse, and used my status as the CEO's wife to have the building manager grant me access to check a plumbing issue. The heavy door clicked open, and the illusion of my marriage shattered on the marble floor. It wasn't a corporate guest house. It was a second home. Framed photos of Julian and Victoria in the Amalfi Coast lined the walls. Her designer clothes shared closet space with his bespoke suits. But the real knife to the chest was sitting on the mahogany desk in the study. It was a draft of a divorce settlement from Julian's private attorney, sitting next to a complex corporate restructuring flowchart. Reading through the documents, the sheer cruelty of his plan became clear. Julian was systematically siphoning all liquid assets out of Vance and Associates, bleeding his own company dry on paper so that by the time he filed for divorce, the firm would look worthless. In his handwritten notes in the margins, he had written, "Clara is financially illiterate now. She'll settle for the Beacon Hill house and a couple $100,000 in alimony, and walk away quietly." I stood in that beautiful, sickening apartment, my heart breaking, but my mind suddenly crystalline and sharp. I didn't cry. I didn't smash the expensive vases. Instead, I took out my phone and photographed every single page. I plugged a flash drive into the unlocked laptop on the desk and copied every financial spreadsheet I could find. The signature on one of those corporate transfer forms looked exactly like mine. The problem was, I had never signed it. 3 months later, Julian filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The financial disclosure his lawyers sent over was a masterpiece of fiction. According to his filings, Vance and Associates was drowning. He claimed the real estate market had frozen their assets. Cash flow was non-existent, and the company was operating at a massive deficit. The Seaport penthouse was listed as a depreciating corporate liability. He painted himself as a tragic, stressed businessman crushed by debt, and generously offered me a $300,000 lump sum and the deed to my own Beacon Hill house as a humanitarian settlement. "I don't want to leave you destitute, Clara," Julian told me over the phone, his voice dripping with faux pity. "But the company is going under. Take the cash. Keep your parents' house. It's the safest thing for you." But my lawyer, Robert Harrison, and the team of forensic accountants I had secretly hired using my remaining personal savings found massive discrepancies. The tax returns submitted to the court didn't match the massive municipal contracts Vance and Associates had recently won. The money hadn't vanished, it had just been rendered invisible. While digging through the firm's 15-year-old archives to prove my early contributions, my forensic team uncovered a bombshell. They pulled the original commercial loan agreement, the one backed by my house. Tucked inside the original covenants was a clause stating that as the sole guarantor of the foundational loan, I legally held a 35% equity stake in the company until the loan was formally discharged with a mutually signed release. Julian had hidden this fact for over a decade. But his audacity didn't stop there. When we subpoenaed the bank's digital records, we found a newly minted modification addendum filed just 2 years ago. The addendum stated that I, Clara Vance, voluntarily relinquished my 35% equity stake, transferring full control to a third-party entity. Below a text was an electronically verified, certified e-signature bearing my name. My husband wasn't just preparing to leave me with nothing. He was preparing to leave me with his debt. My forensic team traced the third-party entity. It was a shell company called Sterling Heights LLC, registered in Delaware to obscure its ownership. The registered agent? Victoria Sterling's younger brother, Julian had forged my electronic signature to transfer my 35% stake to his mistress's shell company. But it got worse. Guided by Victoria's financial expertise, Julian had immediately leveraged those stolen shares to take out a new, high-interest, $5 million corporate loan from a shadow lender. That $5 million was instantly dispersed into offshore accounts controlled by Sterling Heights LLC under the guise of strategic consulting fees. The trap was viciously brilliant. After the divorce, Julian planned to declare Vance and Associates bankrupt. The creditors would seize the shares. And according to the fine print of the new loan, I, as the original guarantor who supposedly never discharged her duties, would be held personally liable for the $5 million default. He didn't just want my money. He was entirely willing to send me to federal prison or leave me crushed by insurmountable debt just to fund his new life. We knew the signature was forged. But proving digital fraud against a wealthy CEO is incredibly difficult. We needed a smoking gun. It arrived in the form of a cryptic email from an anonymous Proton Mail account, asking me to meet at a quiet diner outside the city. The man waiting in the booth was Marcus Thorne, the former IT director for Vance and Associates, who had been abruptly fired a year ago during budget cuts. Marcus looked exhausted, but his eyes were resolute. He slid a decrypted hard drive across the Formica table. "Clara, I can't watch him do this to you," Marcus said quietly. 2 years ago, Julian ordered me to bypass internal security protocols and extract your digital signature certificate from the old HR servers. When I pushed back, he told me it was standard legal housekeeping and you had approved it. Marcus took a sip of his black coffee. But a week later, I overheard him talking to Victoria. He told her, "By the time the old bat realizes what happened, the assets will be offshore and the ink will be dry." Marcus revealed something else. Victoria had orchestrated the shell company, but Julian had lied to her, too. She had no idea he had tied the $5 million toxic debt to her brother's name as a secondary liability. Julian was using his mistress as a legal meat shield. The hard drive Marcus gave me contained the Holy Grail. System logs proving the IP address that generated my forged signature originated directly from Julian's private office computer, alongside audio recordings Marcus had secretly taken to protect himself before he was fired. Victoria thought she was his partner. In reality, she was his cover. With apocalyptic evidence in our hands, Robert and I didn't rush to the police. We knew Julian was a master manipulator with top-tier lawyers. If we tipped our hand early, they would file endless injunctions, claim a corporate hack, and tie us up in litigation for years. Instead, we built a trap out of Julian's own hubris. We let him build his house of lies under penalty of perjury, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the pin. Our strategy was simple. Let him swear I never contributed. Then, drop the original loan document. Let him swear he had no liquid assets. Then, drop the shell company transfers. Let him swear I signed my shares away. Then, prove the forgery. I had learned one vital truth about the legal system. You don't have to prove your opponent is an awful person. You just have to definitively prove they are lying about one crucial fact. Once you break their credibility in front of a judge, the rest of their armor shatters. Which brings us back to the Boston courtroom. After the judge demanded an explanation for the original loan document, Julian recovered his composure. He adjusted his tie and offered a dismissive smile. Your Honor, I don't deny Clara helped with some paperwork 15 years ago. But 2 years ago, we reached a new agreement. She signed an addendum relinquishing her shares in exchange for paying off the mortgage on her Beacon Hill property. The electronic signature was legally verified. My counsel has the certified copy right here. Julian's lawyer handed the addendum to the clerk. Julian shot me a triumphant look. A silent declaration of checkmate. The judge looked at the addendum, then turned to the supplemental binder my attorney had just handed up. The judge's face went from stern to a mask of absolute fury. Mr. Vance. The judge's voice dropped an octave, carrying a lethal weight. You are testifying under oath that your wife personally logged into the system and executed this electronic signature at exactly 2 p.m. on April 12th. Yes, Your Honor. She signed it herself. Julian stated firmly. The judge picked up a piece of paper from my binder. Then perhaps, Mr. Vance, you can explain to this court how your wife managed to execute a complex digital legal document. When, according to these subpoenaed medical records from Massachusetts General Hospital, Clara Vance was under heavy general anesthesia undergoing an emergency appendectomy for the entirety of April 12th. The courtroom erupted into a low murmur of shock. Julian's face drained of all color. Furthermore, the judge continued mercilessly. The IT forensic logs provided to this court show that the IP address used to execute this signature traces exactly to the private desktop inside your locked office at Vance & Associates. Julian stumbled back a half step, looking like the floor had vanished beneath him. His attorney practically leaped out of his chair, stammering, Your Honor, we request a recess. There appears to be a technical misunderstanding. Behind them, Victoria Sterling stood up. The realization had just hit her. The audio transcripts my lawyer had submitted to opposing counsel that morning proved Julian had set up her and her brother to take the fall for the federal wire fraud. Realizing she was nothing but a sacrificial pawn, Victoria's self-preservation kicked in. She looked at Julian with pure venom, then addressed the court directly. Your Honor, I wish to make a statement, she said, her voice shaking with rage. I had no knowledge that Clara Vance's signature was forged. Julian Vance orchestrated the creation of the shell entities, and he explicitly ordered me to move those funds. The judge wasn't interested in the affair anymore. One false signature had just turned our divorce into a massive federal crime. The judge didn't even call for a recess. He struck his gavel with a force that echoed off the mahogany walls, effectively executing Julian's empire. This court finds credible evidence of severe financial fraud, perjury, and felony forgery. The judge declared, I am issuing an immediate total freeze on all personal and corporate assets tied to Julian Vance and Vance and Associates, including Sterling Heights LLC. Pending a complete forensic audit, I hereby void the April 12 modification addendum in its entirety. Clara Vance's 35% equity stake in the company is fully reinstated. Furthermore, Clara Vance is legally shielded from any and all liability regarding the fraudulent $5 million loan. Finally, the clerk is instructed to forward the entirety of today's transcripts, forensics, and financial disclosures to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation into Mr. Five Vance. Julian collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. In less than 20 minutes, the kingdom he had built on lies had been burned to the ground. The fallout was biblical. By Monday morning, news of the forged signatures and the pending criminal investigation hit the Boston financial papers. Investors pulled their funding. Major municipal developers canceled their contracts, refusing to do business with a CEO facing federal fraud charges. The banks called in their loans immediately. To save herself from a lengthy prison sentence, Victoria Sterling flipped completely. She handed over every encrypted email, hidden ledger, and offshore routing number to the district attorney, laying bare the entirety of Julian's financial crimes. Julian was stripped of his CEO title by the Emergency Board of Directors, guided by Robert Harrison. I exercised my rightful 35% equity and gathered the support of the remaining minor shareholders. I took control of the board, ousted Julian's loyalists, and began the grueling work of restructuring the legitimate, solvent branches of the company. My name, Clara Vance, was reinstated in the corporate registry, not as the wife of the founder, but as the foundational guarantor, the primary shareholder, and the woman who ultimately saved the firm from ruin. A month later, just days before Julian was scheduled to be formally indicted by the DA, he asked to meet me at the Vance and Associates headquarters in the office that now belonged to me. He didn't wear a bespoke suit this time. He looked like a ghost of the man I had married. His hair was unkempt, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. He stood awkwardly by the door, staring at me, sitting behind the CEO's desk. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling with a mix of resentment and despair. Clara, how long were you planning this? Did you start building this trap the second you found out about Victoria? I looked at the man who had been my entire world for 15 years. I realized I didn't hate him anymore. I felt nothing but a profound, quiet peace. I stood up, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, and looked out over the Boston skyline. I didn't plan against you, Julian, I said softly, looking over my shoulder at him. I just stopped protecting your lies. I didn't give him a grand speech. I didn't yell. That single sentence severed the final thread between us. He had spent years trying to rewrite our story. But in the end, the original documents spoke for themselves. The divorce was finalized shortly after. With the assets properly divided and my equity secured, I walked away with profound financial independence. I didn't stay in the corporate world forever. I hired a competent CEO to run Vance and Associates, retaining my seat on the board. I used a portion of my settlement to buy a beautiful, historic brick home in a quiet Boston suburb, complete with a sprawling garden of hydrangeas, something I had always wanted but never had the time to cultivate when I was busy building Julian's dream. More importantly, I established the Clara Vance Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing free forensic accounting and legal services to women facing financial abuse and corporate concealment in divorces. I used my nightmare to light a beacon for other women who were being erased by powerful men. Sometimes, people will try to write you out of their story. They will try to minimize your sacrifices and steal your light. But I learned that you don't reclaim your life by trying to destroy the person who hurt you. You reclaim it by refusing to disappear, by finding your evidence, and by standing firmly in your own truth.